She had been alone for years. No family left, no close friends. And though she had always found solace in solitude, the invitation stirred something dark within her, something she couldn't ignore. Lena's hand trembled as she held the old yellowed envelope. The wax seal had long since cracked, and the paper was fragile, as if it might disintegrate in her fingers. But it was the invitation itself that made her stomach twist with unease. It was a simple message, written in elegant script. "You are invited to Hollowbrook Manor. Come. It is time for you to remember." There was no return address, no signature, just that cryptic, unsettling message. It had come yesterday, tucked into her mailbox. No one had seen her since she'd moved into the old house at the edge of town, and yet someone knew her name. Someone had found her. Safety. The envelope was addressed to her, but the handwriting didn't look familiar. She had never heard of Hollowbrook Manor before. What made it even stranger was the fact that the address on the envelope wasn't anywhere in town. There was no Hollowbrook Manor. She had heard rumors of strange happenings around these parts, disappearances, eerie sightings, and stories of an old mansion deep in the woods, untouched by time. But she had never paid much attention to those stories. She had thought them to be nothing more than whispered tales spun by the locals. But now, with the letter in her hand, those rumors felt real. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. The darkness outside was thick, heavy, as if the night itself was pressing in on her. The house was silent, its walls creaking and groaning as though it too was waiting for something to happen. She sat down at the small desk in the corner of the room, her fingers shaking as she opened the envelope. The paper inside was cold, brittle. She unfolded it slowly, almost afraid of what she might find. A simple note was written inside, in the same flowing handwriting. "You are the last one. The others have forgotten. You are the key to what was lost. Come to Hollowbrook Manor. The door is waiting." The words felt like a cold breath against her neck, chilling her to the bone. Her pulse quickened and she felt a strange pull toward the message, as if it were calling her. It was almost as if the house itself was beckoning her to answer the invitation. Lena hesitated. She didn't want to go. Everything in her screamed to burn the letter, to ignore it, to forget about it. But the pull, the force inside her that urged her to go, was overwhelming. She was suddenly very aware of the stillness around her, the darkness pressing against the walls. A flash of movement caught her eye, a shadow shifting just outside her window. A cold gust of wind rushed through the room, rattling the glass. She stood up abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest, and rushed to the window. But when she pulled the curtains back, there was nothing there, just the same empty moonlit yard. But as her hand fell from the curtain, her eyes caught a reflection, one that made her breath catch in her throat. There, behind her in the glass, was a figure. It was faint at first, an indistinct shape, but as she turned around, the figure solidified. A tall, gaunt man standing just beyond the threshold of her room. His face was pale, ghostly, his eyes empty voids that seemed to suck in the light around him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her. "Who are you?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. But the figure didn't respond. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But as she turned toward the door to flee, the figure stepped forward. "Come to Hollowbrook," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow, the words reverberating in her ears like an echo from far away. "The door is waiting." The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, the house groaning in a way that sent a chill running up her spine. Her vision blurred, and she found herself stumbling backward, unable to breathe. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Lena stood in the middle of her room, trembling, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was silent again, the figure no longer there, but the feeling of something lingering, something watching, didn't go away. What have I gotten myself into? The letter, the figure, the whispers, everything pointed back to Hollowbrook Manor. But why her? And what was it waiting for? The next day, Lena found herself standing in front of an old iron-wrought gate, the metal twisted and rusted with age. Beyond it stood a mansion, a large, imposing structure that seemed to loom over her. The house was silent, its windows dark. The air was thick with the scent of decay and neglect. Hollowbrook Manor. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, perhaps even longer. Vines snaked up the walls, thick and overgrown, their leaves curling like tendrils reaching for the sky. The path leading to the front door was cracked, and the once grand steps were now chipped and broken. Lena took a deep breath, her heart racing. The invitation had brought her here, but now that she was standing in front of the manor, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. But what if it's the only way to find out the truth? With a sudden resolve, she stepped forward, pushing open the creaking gate. It groaned in protest, as though reluctant to allow her entry. But Lena didn't stop. She walked up the broken path, her footsteps muffled by the thick overgrowth, until she reached the front door. It was grand, dark wood carved with intricate designs, the handles worn smooth from years of use. The door stood ajar, as if waiting for her to enter. Lena reached out, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the door. It was strangely warm against her touch, as if the house itself was alive, breathing. With a deep breath, she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay was even stronger. The grand foyer stretched before her, its high ceilings and grand staircase casting long shadows across the room. The walls were adorned with portraits, faces of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow her as she moved. She was not alone. The floor creaked beneath her as she stepped deeper into the manor, her breath shallow, her skin crawling with a feeling she couldn't shake. She could feel it. Something was here. Something waiting. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air grew heavy, thick with a presence she couldn't explain. A low creak echoed from upstairs. "Is someone there?" Lena called out, her voice weak in the silence. But there was no reply, only the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the stairs. She took a step back, her eyes wide, her heart thundered in her chest. And then the whisper again. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. "You're too late." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something, or someone, approaching her from the stairs above. She wanted to run, to escape, but her feet felt glued to the floor as though the house itself had taken hold of her. "Hello?" Lena called out again, her voice cracking with fear, her hands trembling at her sides. "Is anyone there?" Lena called. The footsteps paused, and then a voice, low, raspy, replied from the darkness above, where the stairs met the upper landing. "You shouldn't have come." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The voice was hoarse, like someone long lost to time, yet there was a terrifying familiarity to it. Something about the way the words were spoken, chilling, as though the speaker had been waiting for her all along, sent a shiver down her spine. "Who are you?" Lena whispered, her voice barely a sound in the eerie silence. She could hear her pulse thudding in her ears, drowning out everything else. There was no reply, only the creak of the floorboards above, as if someone, no, something, was watching her from the shadows. "Alex!" Suddenly the air in the room grew even colder, and Lena felt a pressure in her chest, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. A soft sound, like a breath, rustled through the room, and she turned quickly, her eyes scanning the dim, dusty space. "You're too late." The whisper was louder now, coming from the far side of the room, just beyond the grand staircase. Lena spun around, her eyes wide with terror. There was no one there, only the portraits on the walls staring back at her. Yet, she felt the presence, a shadow moving against the walls, slipping through the cracks in the room like liquid darkness. Get behind me." Her skin prickled, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. Her feet felt like lead, heavy and unwilling to cooperate. The air was thick, stifling, making it hard to breathe. She stepped back toward the door, but as her hand reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the walls, making her jump. Lena spun around, now truly afraid. The door, the only way out, was sealed. She was trapped. "Now," she whispered, "no." Her mind raced as she desperately searched the room for an escape. The windows were too high, the walls too thick. Her heart hammered in her chest as she felt a presence moving toward her. She wasn't alone in the room anymore. Whatever had been upstairs, whatever had whispered to her, was now here, in this room. And it was waiting. Suddenly she heard a voice behind her, close, too close. "You shouldn't have come back." Lena whipped around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just the same eerie silence. But the voice, it felt like it was inside her mind, inescapable, whispering its malicious warning, like a dark secret she was never meant to uncover. In that moment she realized something she had ignored when she first entered this place. The manor wasn't just a house, it was a prison for the forgotten. Something had happened here, something terrible, and she was part of it. She had come back to face it, whether she wanted to or not. "You're not supposed to remember," the voice whispered again, and Lena felt her blood run cold. She turned toward the stairs, her feet moving against her will, drawn toward the source of the voice, toward the darkness at the top of the stairs. "No more running," her mind screamed. She didn't know what was waiting for her upstairs, but she had to know. She had to find out the truth. Steeling herself, Lena began to climb the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The air was colder now, the house itself almost suffocating in its silence. As she ascended, she felt the presence closing in around her, the air growing thicker, like something was pressing down on her shoulders. The second floor was just as dark, just as abandoned as the first. Long, empty corridors stretched out before her, the rooms lined with dusty furniture, broken mirrors, and faded curtains. But something was different here. Something off. There was a palpable sense of wrongness in the air, something she couldn't put her finger on, but knew was there. She continued forward, walking cautiously down the hall. The walls seemed to close in on her, the floor groaning beneath her feet. It felt like the house was alive, watching her every move, waiting for her to make the wrong choice. Lena paused in front of a large wooden door, its surface scarred and weathered by time. The air around it felt heavier, the atmosphere thick with an unnatural tension. This door, unlike the others, seemed to call to her. She felt drawn to it, as though it were the key to everything. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, cold and smooth. She hesitated for only a moment before turning it, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the pale moonlight that filtered through the cracked windows. Dust hung in the air like a veil, making it hard to see clearly. But as her eyes adjusted, Lena's breath caught in her throat. The room was a shrine. On the far wall, a large, ornate mirror hung. It was cracked, the glass splintered in jagged lines, but still it seemed to draw Lena in. But it wasn't the mirror itself that held her attention. It was what was in front of it. There, in the center of the room, stood a chair. It was old, its fabric torn and frayed, and tied to the arms of the chair were thick, rusted chains. On the floor beside it, a dark stain had soaked into the wood, the color so deep, so dark, that it could only be blood. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she took another step into the room, drawn by an unseen force. A voice echoed through the room, the same voice from before. "It's time to remember." Lena's mind raced. What am I supposed to remember? What happened here? Suddenly she felt it. A shift in the air. The temperature dropped, the shadows in the corners of the room lengthening, creeping toward her like fingers reaching for her skin. Something was in the room with her. Something was waiting. All eyes in the half were propped up towards her. Something was waiting. As Lena turned toward the mirror, the reflection in it was no longer just her own. There, in the glass, stood a figure. A woman with dark, hollow eyes, blood-stained hands, and a twisted smile that made Lena's skin crawl. "You remember me now?" the woman whispered from the mirror, her voice twisted with malice.